During Christmas dinner, my daughter-in-law announced she was pregnant with the family's first grandchild. Everyone celebrated, and she received $100,000 from me as a gift. But I had seen her leaving an abortion clinic the week before. Listen to my story until the end, and comment which city you're watching me from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitmore. I am 73 years old, and everything began on that fateful Christmas Eve when the snow fell like tiny diamonds against our dining room windows. The house was filled with the warm aroma of roasted turkey and cinnamon, the same scents that had graced our family gatherings for decades. I had spent the entire day preparing for what I believed would be another peaceful holiday celebration with my son Robert, his wife Victoria, and our small but cherished family circle. Robert had married Victoria 3 years prior, and while I had initially harbored some reservations about their relationship, I had grown to appreciate her vivacious personality and seemingly genuine affection for my son. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, with auburn hair that caught the light beautifully, and green eyes that sparkled with mischief. Perhaps it was that very mischief that should have warned me of what was to come. The dining room table was set with my finest china, the Spode Christmas tree pattern that had been in our family for 2 generations. Crystal glasses gleamed under the chandelier, and the silverware my late husband Theodore had given me for our 25th wedding anniversary reflected the warm glow of the candles I had placed as centerpieces. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. As we gathered around the table, I noticed Victoria seemed unusually animated, her cheeks flushed with excitement that went beyond the typical holiday cheer. She kept glancing at Robert with meaningful looks, the kind that pass between couples who share a secret. My son appeared equally enthusiastic, though he was clearly struggling to contain whatever news they were preparing to share. During the main course, as I was carving the turkey with the precision that comes from decades of hosting family dinners, Victoria suddenly stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that cut through our comfortable conversation. She raised her glass of what I had assumed was wine, but now realized was sparkling cider, and cleared her throat dramatically. "I have an announcement to make," she declared, her voice trembling with what appeared to be overwhelming joy. "Robert and I are expecting a baby, your first grandchild, Margaret." The room erupted in celebration. Robert jumped up from his seat and embraced his wife, spinning her around while she laughed with delight. My heart should have soared with happiness at this news, and initially it did. The prospect of becoming a grandmother had always been a dream of mine, especially since Theodore's passing 5 years earlier had left such a void in my life. But then, like a cold shadow creeping across my consciousness, a memory surfaced that turned my blood to ice. Just the week before, on a grey Tuesday morning, I had seen Victoria coming out of the Riverside Women's Health Clinic on Maple Street. I remembered it clearly because I had been there myself for my annual mammogram, and I had been surprised to see my daughter-in-law emerging from the same building, looking around nervously as if she didn't want to be seen. At the time, I had assumed she was there for a routine gynecological appointment and had thought nothing more of it. But now, as I watched her accept congratulations and bask in the attention of our small gathering, a terrible suspicion began to form in my mind. The Riverside Women's Health Clinic was known for more than just routine women's care. It was one of the few facilities in our area that provided comprehensive reproductive services, including procedures that some people preferred to keep private. Despite my growing unease, I managed to maintain my composure and offer my congratulations. "Oh, Victoria, this is wonderful news," I exclaimed, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "How far along are you, dear?" "Just 8 weeks," she replied, placing a protective hand over her still flat stomach. "We wanted to wait until we were sure everything was progressing normally before we told anyone." 8 weeks. The timing made my stomach churn with dread. If she was indeed 8 weeks pregnant now, she would have been approximately 7 weeks along when I saw her at the clinic. The implications were too horrible to contemplate, yet I couldn't shake the image of her furtive behavior as she had hurried to her car that Tuesday morning. "This calls for a celebration," Robert announced, his face beaming with pride. "Mom, I know this might seem premature, but Victoria and I have been discussing our future, and we realize we're going to need help preparing for the baby. The house needs renovations, we'll need furniture, and there are so many expenses." I should have seen it coming. The setup was too perfect, too rehearsed. Victoria chimed in with practiced timing. "We would never ask for charity, Margaret, but if you felt inclined to help us get started on this incredible journey, it would mean the world to us." Looking back, I realize I was caught completely off guard by the emotional manipulation of the moment. The joy of becoming a grandmother, the Christmas spirit, the carefully orchestrated presentation, it all combined to cloud my judgment. Before I could think rationally about what I was doing, I found myself reaching for my checkbook. "Of course, darling," I heard myself saying, "this is such momentous news. I want to make sure my first grandchild has everything they could possibly need." With trembling hands, I wrote out a check for $100,000, a substantial portion of my retirement savings that I had been carefully managing since Theodore's death. Victoria's eyes widened as she saw the amount, and for just a moment, I caught a flicker of something that might have been guilt or surprise, but it passed so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined it. She threw her arms around me with what seemed like genuine gratitude, thanking me profusely while Robert looked on with obvious relief and satisfaction. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of baby talk and future planning. Victoria and Robert discussed names, nursery themes, and parenting philosophies with the enthusiasm of expectant parents. Yet throughout the celebration, I couldn't shake the memory of seeing Victoria at that clinic, and a cold knot of suspicion continued to grow in my chest. Over the following days, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything else. The image of Victoria's nervous demeanor outside the clinic played in my mind like a broken record. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, telling myself that there could be dozens of innocent explanations for her presence there. Perhaps she had been consulting with a specialist about fertility issues. Maybe she had been getting prenatal care. The possibilities were endless, and I felt guilty for entertaining such dark thoughts about my daughter-in-law. But doubt is a persistent companion, and mine grew stronger with each passing day. I began to pay closer attention to Victoria's behavior, looking for signs that might confirm or dispel my suspicions. What I observed only added to my concerns. For someone who was supposedly 8 weeks pregnant, Victoria showed no signs of morning sickness or fatigue that typically accompany early pregnancy. She continued her regular exercise routine without modification, maintained her normal diet including foods that pregnant women are advised to avoid, and showed no evidence of the heightened emotional sensitivity that often characterizes the first trimester. More troubling still, she seemed uncommonly knowledgeable about pregnancy symptoms and timing, as if she had researched the subject extensively rather than experiencing it naturally. When well-meaning friends and neighbors asked about her symptoms, she always had perfectly textbook responses that seemed rehearsed rather than genuine. 2 weeks after Christmas, my suspicions reached a breaking point when I overheard a phone conversation between Victoria and someone she addressed only as Sarah. I had stopped by their house unannounced to drop off some baby clothes that a friend had given me, and I let myself in through the back door as I had always done. Victoria was in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones, apparently unaware of my presence. "The old lady bought it completely," she was saying. "Hook, line, and sinker. $100,000, can you believe it? I told you this plan would work perfectly." I froze in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs as I strained to hear more. "No, of course I'm not actually pregnant," Victoria continued with a laugh that sent chills down my spine. "That problem was taken care of last week, just like we discussed. But she doesn't need to know that. By the time she figures anything out, if she ever does, we'll be long gone with the money." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the full magnitude of Victoria's deception crashed over me. Not only had she lied about being pregnant to manipulate money from me, but she had apparently terminated a real pregnancy, and was now using the emotional weight of that decision as part of an elaborate con game. I backed out of the house as quietly as I had entered, my mind reeling with shock and betrayal. The woman I had welcomed into our family, the woman I had grown to care for despite my initial reservations, had played me for a fool. Worse still, my own son appeared to be complicit in the scheme. That night I sat in Theodore's old chair in our living room, staring at the family photos on the mantelpiece and trying to process what I had learned. The check I had written represented years of careful savings, money I had set aside for my own care in my advancing years. More than the financial loss, however, was the devastating emotional betrayal. The joy I had felt at the prospect of becoming a grandmother had been weaponized against me. I spent sleepless nights wrestling with what to do with this knowledge. Part of me wanted to confront Victoria and Robert immediately, to demand answers and the return of my money. Another part of me feared the confrontation would destroy what remained of my relationship with my son. Despite everything, Robert was still my child, and the thought of losing him completely was almost unbearable. But as the days passed, my anger began to outweigh my fear. I realized that doing nothing would be tantamount to enabling their deception, and I owed it to myself and to the memory of my late husband to fight back. Theodore had always taught me to stand up for myself and not let others take advantage of my kindness. I decided to gather more evidence before making any moves. If I was going to confront them, I wanted to be absolutely certain of my facts and prepared for their inevitable denials. I began keeping detailed notes of Victoria's behavior, documenting instances where her supposed pregnancy symptoms didn't align with medical reality. I also reached out to my longtime friend Helen, whose daughter worked as a nurse at the Riverside Women's Health Clinic. Without revealing the specific situation, I asked Helen to have her daughter discreetly inquire about patient confidentiality policies and what records might be accessible in certain circumstances. What I learned was both encouraging and disturbing. While medical records are strictly confidential, Helen's daughter mentioned that the clinic had recently been dealing with insurance fraud cases where patients had falsified pregnancy claims for financial gain. She couldn't provide specific information, but her general comments suggested that my suspicions might not be as far-fetched as I had hoped. 3 weeks after the Christmas revelation, another piece of the puzzle fell into place when I encountered Dr. Patricia Henley, my longtime gynecologist, at the grocery store. During our casual conversation, she mentioned that she had recently seen Victoria at the clinic, where she occasionally consulted. "Such a sweet girl," Dr. Henley commented innocently. Though I was sorry to hear about her difficult decision, these situations are never easy for young couples. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications of her words. Dr. Henley had just confirmed, albeit indirectly, that Victoria had indeed been at the clinic for the procedure I had suspected. The difficult decision could only refer to one thing. I managed to maintain my composure during the conversation with Dr. Henley, but as soon as I returned home, I broke down completely. The confirmation of my worst fears was devastating. Victoria had not only deceived me about being pregnant, but had built her entire con game around the ashes of a real pregnancy that she had chosen to terminate. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. While I respected a woman's right to make her own reproductive choices, using the aftermath of such a decision to perpetrate fraud against a family member was unconscionable. The emotional manipulation involved in the scheme was particularly cruel, as it had exploited my natural desire for grandchildren and my genuine affection for what I had believed was a growing family. As January progressed, Victoria and Robert continued their charade with increasing boldness. They showed me ultrasound images that I later realized were generic photos downloaded from the internet. They discussed doctor's appointments that I suspected never took place. Victoria even began wearing loose-fitting clothing and occasionally placing her hand on her stomach in the protective gesture common among expectant mothers. The performance was elaborate and well-rehearsed, but knowing the truth made every interaction feel like a knife twist in my heart. I found myself studying my son's face during these conversations, looking for signs of guilt or remorse. What I saw was even more troubling than Victoria's calculated deception. Robert appeared to be genuinely enjoying the performance, reveling in my excitement about becoming a grandmother and already making plans for how to spend the money I had given them. It became clear that this was not a case of Victoria manipulating my innocent son, but rather a joint venture in which both parties were equally culpable. The realization that my own child could be capable of such callous deception was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire ordeal. By early February, I had decided that I could no longer remain silent. The emotional toll of keeping the secret was affecting my health, and I found myself losing sleep and appetite as the stress of the situation consumed me. I knew that confronting them would likely result in a permanent rift in our family, but I also knew that I couldn't continue to be a willing victim of their scheme. I chose to confront them on a Saturday evening when they had invited me over for dinner, another of their regular performances designed to maintain the illusion of our happy family dynamic. As we sat in their living room after the meal, Victoria was enthusiastically showing me paint samples for the nursery they claimed to be planning. "I've been thinking about the baby's room," she said, her voice filled with the excitement of an expectant mother. "I'm leaning toward a neutral color scheme since we want to be surprised about the gender." It was the perfect opening for what I had to say. "Victoria," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about this pregnancy." She looked up from the paint samples, a flicker of wariness crossing her features. "What do you mean, Margaret? Is everything okay? I saw you coming out of the Riverside Women's Health Clinic the week before Christmas," I said quietly, "and I know what kind of services they provide there." The color drained from Victoria's face, but she recovered quickly, adopting an expression of confused innocence. "I don't understand what you're implying. I go there for regular gynecological care. That's where I confirmed the pregnancy." "No," I replied firmly. "I've spoken with Dr. Henley and I know that's not true. I also overheard your phone conversation with Sarah 2 weeks ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's mask of innocence finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Robert, who had been listening with growing alarm, stepped forward protectively. "Mom, what are you suggesting?" he demanded. "Are you accusing Victoria of lying about our baby?" "I'm not suggesting anything," I replied, rising from my chair with as much dignity as I could muster. "I'm stating a fact. There is no baby, Robert. There never was going to be a baby after that Tuesday morning visit to the clinic, and both of you have been lying to me for weeks to keep that $100,000 I gave you." The explosion that followed was as devastating as I had expected. Victoria immediately went on the offensive, accusing me of invading her privacy and making wild accusations based on circumstantial evidence. She demanded to know what right I had to spy on her and suggested that my age was affecting my judgment. Robert initially tried to defend his wife, but as I calmly laid out the evidence I had gathered, I could see doubt beginning to creep into his expression. When I mentioned the overheard phone conversation with specific quotes, Victoria's defensive posture crumbled slightly. "You don't understand the situation," she finally said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "Yes, I had a procedure, but it was for medical reasons. The pregnancy wasn't viable. I didn't want to worry you with the details." "Then why did you announce the pregnancy at Christmas dinner?" I asked. "Why accept my money if you already knew there would be no baby? We were hoping. We thought maybe we could try again quickly, and you'd never need to know about the complication," Robert interjected, but his explanation sounded weak and rehearsed. "And what about the conversation I overheard?" I pressed. "The one where Victoria laughed about fooling the old lady and talked about being long gone with the money?" Victoria's face hardened, and for the first time I saw her true nature clearly. Gone was the sweet, caring daughter-in-law I thought I knew. In her place stood a woman whose eyes held no warmth, no remorse, only cold fury at being caught. "Fine," she said flatly. You want the truth? Here it is. Yes, I had an abortion. It was my choice and I don't regret it. And yes, we saw an opportunity to get some financial security from you, and we took it. You're wealthy, Margaret. You live alone in that big house with more money than you could spend in your remaining years. We're young and struggling to build our lives, so we redistributed some of the wealth. Consider it an early inheritance. The callousness of her words hit me like a physical blow. Not only had they stolen from me, but Victoria was now trying to justify it as some sort of Robin Hood scenario. The entitlement in her voice was staggering. Robert, to his credit, looked horrified by his wife's blunt admission. "Victoria, stop," he said weakly. This isn't who we are. This is exactly who we are," she snapped back. "This is who we had to become to survive. Do you think your precious mother would have just handed over $100,000 if we'd asked honestly? Of course not. Sometimes you have to be creative to get what you deserve." "What I deserve," I said, my voice rising for the first time during the confrontation. "What exactly do you think you deserve from me, Victoria? I welcomed you into this family. I treated you like the daughter I never had. I supported your relationship with my son, even when I had reservations. And this is how you repay that kindness." "Your kindness came with strings attached," she replied coldly. "Everything with you has always been about control. The perfect family dinners, the expectation that we'd visit every week, the subtle comments about when we were going to give you grandchildren. You wanted to buy your way into relevance in our lives, and we let you. The only difference is that now you know the price." Her words were designed to hurt, and they succeeded. There was enough truth in her accusations to make them sting. Had I been too controlling? Had my desire for family closeness crossed lines I hadn't recognized? But even if there was validity to her criticisms, it didn't justify their deception and theft. "I want my money back," I said simply. "All of it. And I want you both out of my life." Victoria laughed bitterly. "Good luck with that, Margaret. We've already spent most of it on debt consolidation and a down payment on a new car. And legally, that money was a gift. You gave it to us voluntarily in front of witnesses. There's no fraud charge that would stick." She was probably right about the legal aspects. I had indeed given them the money as a gift, and proving fraud would be difficult without recorded evidence of their confession. But her smugness only strengthened my resolve to find some way to seek justice. The confrontation ended with Robert trying to mediate between his mother and his wife, but it was clear that any hope of reconciliation was gone. Victoria had shown her true colors, and even Robert seemed shaken by the depth of her callousness. As I prepared to leave their house, I wondered if this would be the last time I would see my son. "Robert," I said quietly as Victoria stormed off to another room, "you're my child, and I love you. But what you've done here is unforgivable. If you have any conscience left, you'll find a way to make this right." He looked at me with tears in his eyes, and for a moment I saw the little boy he used to be. "Mom, I never meant for it to go this far. It spiraled out of control." "Then stop the spiral," I replied. "It's not too late to be the man your father and I raised you to be." I left their house that night not knowing if I would ever speak to my son again. The drive home was one of the longest of my life, filled with a mixture of grief, anger, and a strange sense of relief that the truth was finally out in the open. Over the following weeks, I found myself dealing with a complex range of emotions. The loss of the money was significant, but the loss of my family was devastating. I had no grandchildren to look forward to, no daughter-in-law to share holidays with, and my relationship with my only child was in ruins. But gradually, another emotion began to emerge: determination. Victoria's arrogant assumption that I would simply accept their theft and move on had underestimated my resolve. While the legal system might not provide a remedy, I realized there were other forms of justice available. I began by consulting with an attorney, not because I expected legal recourse, but because I wanted to understand all of my options. My lawyer, Patricia Goldman, was a sharp woman in her 50s who had handled several family financial disputes. After reviewing the situation, She confirmed my suspicions about the legal challenges. "The problem is that you voluntarily gave them the money as a gift," she explained. "Even though their representation about the pregnancy was false, proving fraudulent intent would be very difficult without recorded admissions or documentary evidence of their plan." So there's nothing I can do?" I asked. "I didn't say that," Patricia replied with a slight smile. "Legal remedies aren't the only form of justice available. Sometimes social consequences can be more effective than court judgments." She was right. Victoria and Robert had built their con game on maintaining appearances and exploiting social expectations. Perhaps those same social dynamics could be turned against them. I started with a carefully worded letter to Robert, sent by certified mail, to establish a paper trail. In it, I laid out everything I knew about their deception and gave them 30 days to return the money before I would be forced to take other measures. I didn't specify what those measures would be, but I wanted them to understand that I wasn't simply going away. Robert called me 3 days after receiving the letter, his voice filled with desperation. "Mom, please don't do anything drastic. Victoria and I are trying to figure out a solution." "What kind of solution?" I asked. "We're looking into getting a loan to pay you back. It might take some time, but we want to make this right." I almost believed him. There was genuine remorse in his voice, and for a moment I hoped that my son had finally recognized the magnitude of what they had done. But as the days passed without any concrete action, it became clear that his call had been another stalling tactic. When the 30-day deadline passed without any contact from them, I decided to implement my alternative justice strategy. I began by reaching out to mutual friends and family members, not to gossip or seek sympathy, but to inform them of the situation in case Victoria and Robert attempted to run similar cons on other family members. My sister Dorothy was the first person I told the complete story to. She lived in the neighboring county and had met Victoria and Robert several times at family gatherings. Her reaction was a mixture of shock and anger that mirrored my own initial response. "I can't believe Robert would be involved in something like this," she said. "Theodore would be heartbroken if he knew what his son had become." "That's what makes it so painful," I replied. "I keep wondering if we failed him somehow, if there were signs we missed when he was younger." "Don't you dare blame yourself for his choices," Dorothy said firmly. "You and Theodore were wonderful parents. Robert is an adult who made his own decisions." Dorothy's support was invaluable, but she also provided something I hadn't expected: information. It turned out that Victoria had approached her at Thanksgiving before the Christmas announcement, with hints about financial difficulties and subtle suggestions that the family should be more supportive of young couples trying to establish themselves. "She never asked directly," Dorothy explained, "but she made several comments about how fortunate you were to have such substantial savings and how challenging it was for their generation to build wealth. I thought she was just making conversation, but now I wonder if she was testing the waters." This revelation suggested that Victoria's con game had been more premeditated than I had realized. She had apparently been laying groundwork for months, identifying potential targets within the family and assessing their financial vulnerabilities. Armed with this new information, I reached out to other family members who had interacted with Victoria and Robert over the past year. What I discovered was a pattern of manipulative behavior that extended far beyond their deception of me. My cousin Martha revealed that Victoria had borrowed $2,000 from her in October, claiming it was for emergency car repairs. The money was never repaid, and when Martha had gently inquired about it, Victoria had become defensive and suggested that family members should help each other without keeping score. My nephew David shared a similar story about a $500 loan that Victoria had requested for what she claimed were medical expenses not covered by insurance. When I added up all the small amounts that various family members had loaned to Victoria and Robert over the past year, the total exceeded $15,000. It became clear that my $100,000 gift had been the culmination of a long-term strategy to extract money from family members through emotional manipulation. Victoria had identified each person's soft spots and crafted specific appeals designed to trigger their generosity. The pattern of behavior also explained why Victoria had been so confident in her assumption that legal action wouldn't be pursued. She had been getting away with smaller cons for months, and no one had challenged her because the individual amounts seemed relatively insignificant and the victims didn't want to create family drama over money. But her greed had finally led her to overreach. The Christmas pregnancy announcement had been designed to secure a major payout that would set them up financially, but the stakes were high enough to motivate serious consequences. As word of Victoria's deception spread through our extended family network, the social consequences began to manifest. Robert called me in early March, his voice strained with stress. "Mum, people are treating us differently. Victoria's lost several clients from her freelance graphic design business. My colleagues at work are asking uncomfortable questions. This needs to stop. It will stop as soon as you return my money," I replied calmly. "I'm not spreading gossip, Robert. I'm simply being honest with people about what happened. If that's causing problems for you and Victoria, perhaps you should consider why your actions have consequences. But you're destroying our reputation over a misunderstanding," he pleaded. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," I said firmly. "This was a calculated deception designed to steal a significant portion of my retirement savings. And based on what I've learned from other family members, it was part of a pattern of financial manipulation that has been going on for months." Robert was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want from us, Mum? What would it take to fix this?" "I want my money back, and I want a sincere apology," I said. "Not just to me, but to everyone you've taken advantage of. And I want assurance that this behavior will never happen again." "We don't have $100,000, he said. "Even if we sold everything we own, we couldn't come up with that much cash immediately." "Then you need to figure out a payment plan that works," I replied. "I'm not unreasonable, but I'm not going away either." The conversation ended without resolution, but I sensed that the social pressure was beginning to have an impact. Victoria's business was suffering as word spread about her deceptive practices, and Robert was apparently facing uncomfortable questions at his job in the bank's loan department, where trust and integrity were essential qualifications. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected visitor. Victoria appeared at my front door on a Tuesday evening, looking haggard and desperate. It was the first time I had seen her since the confrontation at their house, and the change in her appearance was startling. Gone was the confident, manipulative woman who had smugly justified her theft. In her place stood someone who looked exhausted and defeated. "Margaret, we need to talk," she said without preamble. I invited her in, more out of curiosity than hospitality. I wanted to hear what she had to say, though I was prepared for another attempt at manipulation. "I want to apologize," she began, but her tone suggested that the words were being extracted under duress rather than offered from genuine remorse. "Things got out of hand, and I know we hurt you. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" I asked. "A forced apology that you're only offering because your scheme has finally caught up with you?" Victoria's facade cracked slightly, revealing the anger beneath her attempt at contrition. "Look, I'm trying to make this right, but you're making it impossible with your campaign to turn everyone against us." "I'm not running a campaign," I replied. "I'm simply being honest when people ask me questions. If the truth makes you look bad, perhaps you should consider changing your behavior rather than asking me to lie for you. You want your money back? Fine, we'll pay you back. But it's going to take time. Robert's looking into getting a second mortgage on the house, and I'm trying to rebuild my client base. But we can't do any of that if you keep poisoning people against us." "How much time?" I asked. 5 years? Maybe longer. "We can probably manage $2,000 a month if we budget carefully." It wasn't ideal, but it was more than I had expected to recover. However, I wasn't prepared to simply accept her word after everything that had happened. "I want a written agreement," I said, "signed by both of you and notarized, and I want collateral to secure the debt." Victoria bristled at my conditions. "You don't trust us?" The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. Trust is something that's earned, Victoria. You've spent the past few months proving that you can't be trusted. If you want to make this right, you'll do it on terms that protect both of us. And what happens to your little truth-telling campaign? She asked bitterly. When I start receiving regular payments according to our agreement, I'll stop feeling the need to warn other people about your financial practices, I replied. But if you default on the payments or try to run another con game, all bets are off. Victoria left that evening without committing to my terms, but her visit had revealed something important. The social consequences of their actions were having a more significant impact than the loss of my money had on me. Their reputation was damaged, their income was affected, and they were beginning to understand that their actions had real costs. A week later, Robert called to schedule a meeting with me and Patricia Goldman, my attorney. He wanted to formalize a repayment agreement, which suggested that Victoria had agreed to my terms, probably under pressure from the ongoing social fallout from their deception. The meeting took place in Patricia's office on a Thursday afternoon. Robert attended alone, explaining that Victoria was dealing with a family emergency, though I suspected she simply couldn't bring herself to face the formal acknowledgement of their debt. The payment plan we agreed to was structured over 6 years, with monthly payments of $1,800 and the title to their house held as collateral. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was more accountability than I had expected to achieve. The legal agreement also included clauses that would accelerate the debt if they attempted to sell major assets or relocate without notification, providing some protection against them trying to disappear with my money. As Robert signed the documents, I studied his face, looking for signs of the young man I had raised. The stress of the past few months had aged him visibly, and there was a sadness in his eyes that suggested he understood the full cost of his choices. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly after the paperwork was completed. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I'm truly sorry for what we did to you." For the first time since the Christmas revelation, his apology sounded genuine. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify or minimize his actions, just simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "I'm sorry too, Robert," I replied. "I'm sorry that our relationship had to come to this. I'm sorry that you felt you couldn't come to me honestly if you were having financial difficulties. And I'm sorry that you chose a partner who brought out the worst in you rather than the best." "Victoria isn't entirely to blame," he said. "I made my own choices. I could have stopped it at any point, but I didn't." It was a mature response, and it gave me a small hope that perhaps my son could still find his way back to being the person his father and I had tried to raise. The first payment arrived on schedule the following month, and I allowed myself to feel cautiously optimistic that the worst was behind us. But life, I've learned, rarely follows the simple patterns we hope for. In June, just 3 months into our payment agreement, I received a call from Dorothy with disturbing news. Victoria had been seen at a local casino, apparently gambling with considerable amounts of money. Several people had witnessed her placing large bets at the blackjack tables over multiple visits. The information was troubling because it suggested that Victoria was continuing her pattern of irresponsible financial behavior even while supposedly working to repay the money she had stolen from me. If she was gambling away money that should have been going toward their debt, it raised serious questions about whether I would ever see full repayment. I decided to investigate the casino reports myself. The Riverside Casino was located about an hour from town, and I had never visited it before. But on a Saturday afternoon, I drove there to see if I could verify the reports about Victoria's gambling activities. I didn't have to wait long. Within an hour of my arrival, I spotted Victoria at a poker table, playing with what appeared to be several $100s in chips. She was dressed expensively, wearing jewelry I didn't recognize, and seemed completely absorbed in the game. Watching her play, I realized that this wasn't casual recreational gambling. Victoria displayed the focused intensity of someone with a serious gambling addiction. She played multiple hands with increasing stakes, and when she lost, her reaction was that of someone who couldn't afford the losses she was experiencing. I stayed at the casino for several hours, observing from a distance. During that time, I watched Victoria lose what I estimated to be over $2,000. When she finally left the table, her demeanor was that of someone who had just made a terrible mistake but was already planning to return. The discovery of Victoria's gambling problem explained several puzzling aspects of their financial situation. It provided another motive for their elaborate con game beyond simple greed. They may have been trying to pay gambling debts or fund Victoria's addiction. It also raised serious concerns about whether our repayment agreement would survive Victoria's continued gambling losses. I confronted Robert with this information during a phone call the next week. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. He wasn't surprised by the news, which meant he already knew about Victoria's gambling problem. "Mum, I can explain," he said wearily, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "Victoria's been struggling with some issues, but she's getting help." "What kind of help?" I demanded, because from what I observed, she's actively gambling away money that should be going toward repaying me. "She's supposed to be attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings," Robert admitted. "But I think she's been lying about that too. I found casino receipts hidden in her car last month." The revelation that Victoria had been lying to her own husband about her gambling activities while simultaneously lying to me about their financial rehabilitation was deeply troubling. It suggested a level of compulsive dishonesty that went beyond their original con game. "Robert, this changes everything," I said. "If Victoria can't control her gambling, how can I trust that you'll be able to make the payments we agreed on?" "I don't know," he said quietly. "I'm trying to figure out how to handle this situation, but every time I think we're making progress, something else comes up." Over the following weeks, my worst fears about Victoria's gambling problem were confirmed. The second payment on our agreement was late, and when it finally arrived, it was $300 short. Robert's explanation was vague and unconvincing, mentioning unexpected expenses and temporary cash flow problems. But I had learned to look beyond their explanations to the patterns of behavior beneath. I hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named James Morrison, to monitor Victoria's activities and provide documentation of her gambling habits. What James discovered was worse than I had imagined. Victoria was visiting casinos an average of 3 times per week, sometimes traveling to facilities in neighboring states to avoid recognition. She had opened several new credit cards in recent months and was using cash advances to fund her gambling. Most disturbing of all, she had apparently forged Robert's signature on loan applications, putting their house at additional risk. The documentation James provided painted a picture of someone whose gambling addiction had spiraled completely out of control. Bank records showed cash withdrawals and credit card advances totaling over $30,000 in just 2 months. This money was disappearing at gaming tables, and the debts were accumulating faster than Victoria and Robert could possibly repay them. When I presented this evidence to Robert during a confrontation in July, the impact was devastating. He broke down completely, admitting that he had been living in denial about the severity of Victoria's problems and his own inability to control the situation. "I don't know what to do anymore," he sobbed. "She promises she'll stop, and then I find more evidence that she's been gambling. She's forged my name on loan documents. She's lied to both of us about everything. I feel like I'm drowning." For the first time since the Christmas revelation, I felt genuine sympathy for my son. While he had been complicit in the original deception, it was becoming clear that he was now as much a victim of Victoria's manipulations as I had been. "You need to leave her, Robert," I said gently. "This isn't going to get better. Victoria has an addiction that she's not addressing honestly, and she's going to destroy both of your lives if you let her." "I can't just abandon her," he replied. "We're married, for better or worse, right?" "This goes beyond worse," I said. "This is criminal behavior. She's committing forgery and fraud. If you stay with her, you could end up facing legal consequences for her actions." Robert's loyalty to his wife was admirable in some ways, but it was also enabling her destructive behavior. As long as he remained in denial about the severity of the situation and continued to shield her from consequences, Victoria would have no incentive to change. The third payment on our agreement never came at all. When I called Robert to inquire about it, his phone had been disconnected. When I drove to their house, I found a "for sale" sign in the front yard and no indication that anyone was living there. They had disappeared, taking with them not only my money, but also whatever assets they had managed to accumulate during our brief repayment period. The house sale, if completed, would generate enough money to pay off their mortgages and loans, but there was no guarantee that any of it would come to me despite our legal agreement. I felt a familiar anger rising as I stood in their empty driveway, realizing that I had been conned once again. Despite all my precautions and legal agreements, Victoria and Robert had found a way to escape accountability for their actions. But this time, I was better prepared. The private investigator I had hired was still on retainer, and I had him begin tracking their movements immediately. Within a week, James had located them in a resort town about 300 miles away, where they appeared to be using assumed names and living in a rented cabin. The information James provided suggested that they had indeed sold the house and were using the proceeds to fund what appeared to be an extended vacation. Victoria was still gambling, now at a tribal casino near their new location, and Robert seemed to be going along with whatever plans she was making. Armed with this information, I returned to Patricia Goldman's office to explore my legal options. The fact that they had fled without fulfilling our payment agreement and were apparently using false identities opened up new possibilities for legal action. "Now we're looking at potential federal crimes," Patricia explained. "Interstate flight to avoid debt, using false identities, and probably wire fraud if they used electronic transfers during the house sale. This is beyond simple civil debt recovery." She recommended that I file a complaint with both local law enforcement and the FBI, providing all the documentation I had gathered about their deceptive practices. While there was still no guarantee of recovering my money, there was now a realistic possibility that Victoria and Robert would face serious criminal charges for their actions. The investigation that followed was more thorough than I had expected. FBI agents interviewed me extensively about the original con game, and they were particularly interested in the pattern of behavior that had emerged over time. The combination of the pregnancy deception, the gambling addiction, the forged loan documents, and their flight from the state created a compelling case for fraud prosecution. Within 2 months, federal authorities had tracked Victoria and Robert to their hiding place and arrested them both. The charges included conspiracy to commit fraud, interstate flight to avoid prosecution, and multiple counts of identity theft and forgery related to Victoria's loan applications. The arrest was reported in our local newspaper, and the story provided details about their elaborate con game that I hadn't shared with anyone. Reading about my own victimization in print was both embarrassing and vindicating. I had been made a fool of, but at least now there was official recognition that I had been the victim of criminals rather than simply a gullible old woman. The legal process that followed was lengthy and complex. Victoria and Robert were extradited back to our state, where they faced additional charges related to their local crimes. Victoria's gambling addiction was used as a mitigating factor by her defense attorney, but the prosecution argued that it was actually an aggravating circumstance that demonstrated her inability to control her criminal impulses. During the trial, details emerged about the full scope of their deception that shocked even me. Victoria had been running similar cons in other states before moving to our area. She had a history of targeting elderly family members and using pregnancy claims to manipulate them financially. Robert had initially been ignorant of her past, but he had become a willing participant once he understood how profitable her schemes could be. The prosecution also revealed that Victoria had never actually been pregnant during the period leading up to Christmas. The entire scenario had been fabricated from the beginning, including fake positive pregnancy tests and manufactured symptoms. The visit I had witnessed at the women's clinic had been for birth control consultations, not pregnancy termination. This revelation was both relieving and disturbing. While it meant that no actual pregnancy had been terminated as part of their con game, it also demonstrated that their deception had been even more premeditated and calculated than I had realized. Victoria was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, while Robert received 3 years due to his cooperation with prosecutors and his status as a secondary participant in the scheme. The judge noted that while Robert's betrayal of his mother was particularly cruel, his gambling-addicted wife had clearly been the mastermind behind their criminal enterprise. During the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement. Standing in that courtroom, looking at my son in his orange jumpsuit, was one of the most difficult moments of my life. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "The financial loss I suffered was significant, but it pales in comparison to the emotional damage caused by this betrayal. These defendants didn't just steal my money, they weaponized my love for family against me. They turned my joy at the prospect of becoming a grandmother into a tool for their criminal enterprise." I looked directly at Robert as I continued. "I raised my son to be honest, compassionate, and responsible. To see him standing here as a convicted criminal breaks my heart in ways that no amount of money could compensate for. But I hope that this experience will finally force him to confront the choices he's made and find a way to become the man his father and I always believed he could be." Victoria stared at me with undisguised hatred during my statement, but Robert kept his eyes downcast, apparently unable to face the magnitude of what he had done to our family. The restitution order required them to pay back not only the $100,000 they had stolen from me, but also the money they had taken from other family members and the costs associated with their prosecution. The total amount exceeded $200,000, money they would be required to pay from their prison wages and any future earnings. Realistically, I knew that I would never see most of that money. Prison wages are minimal, and once Victoria and Robert were released, their criminal records would make it difficult for them to find employment that would generate significant income. But the symbolic victory of having their crimes officially recognized and punished was valuable beyond any financial consideration. The trial and sentencing process took nearly 2 years to complete, during which time I found myself rebuilding my life in unexpected ways. The stress and betrayal I had experienced had initially left me feeling isolated and suspicious of others' motives, but gradually I began to reconnect with family members and friends who had supported me throughout the ordeal. Dorothy, my sister, was particularly instrumental in helping me process the emotional aftermath of Robert's betrayal. She encouraged me to seek counseling to deal with the complex feelings of grief, anger, and guilt that I was experiencing. "You need to forgive yourself," she told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "You were a victim of experienced criminals who knew exactly how to manipulate your emotions. There's no shame in being deceived by people you trusted." The counseling did help, though it took time to fully accept that I hadn't been responsible for Robert's choices. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, helped me understand that my desire to be a loving mother and grandmother had been exploited by people who had no qualms about using family bonds as weapons. "Your love for your family wasn't a weakness," Dr. Chen explained. "It was a strength that was perverted by people with no moral boundaries. The fault lies with them, not with you." As the months passed, I began to rebuild my financial security and emotional well-being. The $100,000 was gone, but my retirement was still secure, thanks to Theodore's careful planning and my own conservative spending habits. More importantly, I was learning to trust again, though with more caution than I had exercised before. In the third year after Victoria and Robert's imprisonment, I received an unexpected letter from Robert. It was the first communication I had received from him since his sentencing, and I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what emotions it might stir up. The letter was different from what I had expected. Instead of self-pity or attempts at justification, it was a straightforward acknowledgement of responsibility and a genuine expression of remorse. "Dear Mom," it began, "I know that no words can undo the damage I've caused, but I need you to know that I understand the full extent of what I did to you and our family. Prison has given me time to think clearly for the first time in years, and I'm horrified by the person I became." He went on to explain that he had been attending counseling and addiction programs in prison, working to understand how he had allowed himself to become involved in Victoria's criminal schemes. He acknowledged that while Victoria's gambling addiction had been a factor, he had made his own choices and was fully responsible for the consequences. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter continued, "and I'm not asking for money or assistance. I just wanted you to know that the son you raised is still in here somewhere, and I'm trying to find him again. Whether or not you ever want to see me again, I love you, and I'm sorry for the pain I've caused." Reading that letter was emotionally exhausting. Part of me wanted to respond with anger, to remind Robert of all the ways he had betrayed my trust and destroyed our family relationship. But another part of me saw glimpses of the thoughtful, caring young man he had once been. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. Instead, I discussed it with Dr. Chen and Dorothy, trying to understand my own feelings and determine what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with Robert going forward. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Dr. Chen reminded me. "You can acknowledge his remorse and even maintain limited contact without putting yourself at risk of being hurt again." After several weeks of consideration, I wrote a brief response. I acknowledged his letter and his apparent progress toward taking responsibility for his actions, but I also made it clear that rebuilding any kind of relationship would require time and consistent evidence of changed behavior. "Actions speak louder than words," I wrote. "If you're truly committed to becoming a better person, prove it through your choices when you're released. Until then, I wish you well in your rehabilitation efforts." It was a cautious response, but it felt appropriate given the circumstances. I wasn't ready to embrace him as if nothing had happened, but I also wasn't prepared to write him off entirely if he was genuinely working to change. Victoria, meanwhile, had made no attempts to contact me or any other family members. According to James Morrison, my private investigator, she was considered a difficult prisoner who continued to deny responsibility for her actions and blamed others for her circumstances. Her behavior in prison suggested that she had learned nothing from the consequences of her criminal activity. As I write this, Victoria and Robert have both been released from prison. Robert completed his sentence 6 months ago and has moved to another state, where he's apparently working in construction and living in a halfway house. He sends me brief updates every few months, sharing information about his job and his progress in counseling, but he hasn't asked for any assistance or attempted to rebuild our personal relationship. Victoria was released 2 months after Robert, and she immediately disappeared from official monitoring. Her parole officer lost contact with her within weeks of her release, and there are outstanding warrants for her arrest related to parole violations. James Morrison believes she has likely returned to her old patterns of criminal behavior, possibly in a different part of the country where her record isn't well known. The restitution payments I receive are minimal, usually less than $50 per month, but they arrive regularly from Robert. Victoria has made no payments toward her portion of the debt, which isn't surprising given her apparent return to criminal activity. Looking back on this entire experience, I'm struck by how a single moment of joy, the announcement of a grandchild, could spiral into such a devastating betrayal. The Christmas dinner when Victoria made her false pregnancy announcement feels like it happened in a different lifetime, when I still believed that family bonds were sacred and that the people I loved would never deliberately hurt me. I've learned painful lessons about the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries, even with family members. While love and generosity are admirable qualities, they can also make us vulnerable to exploitation by people who don't share our values or moral boundaries. But I've also learned that it's possible to survive even devastating betrayals and rebuild a meaningful life. The money Victoria and Robert stole was significant, but it didn't destroy my financial security. The emotional damage they caused was profound, but it didn't permanently destroy my ability to trust and love. Today, I maintain relationships with the family members who supported me through this crisis. Dorothy and I speak weekly, and our bond has actually strengthened through this shared experience. My other relatives have also rallied around me, creating a support network that is in many ways stronger than what I had before. I've also found new purposes for my life. I volunteer with a local organization that provides support to elderly victims of financial fraud, sharing my experience to help others recognize and avoid similar scams. The work is emotionally challenging, but it's also deeply rewarding to help people who have been through experiences similar to mine. My relationship with Robert remains complicated and distant. His letters suggest that he is genuinely working to rebuild his life and take responsibility for his actions. But trust, once broken so completely, is difficult to restore. I respond to his updates, and I don't wish him ill, but I also don't pretend that we can simply return to the mother-son relationship we once had. Perhaps someday, if he continues to demonstrate through his actions that he has truly changed, we might be able to rebuild some form of relationship. But for now, I'm content to maintain cautious distance while hoping that he continues on a positive path. As for Victoria, she represents a type of person I never fully understood before this experience. Someone who is capable of elaborate deception and manipulation without apparent conscience or remorse. Her gambling addiction may have been a contributing factor to her criminal behavior, but her willingness to exploit family relationships and her complete lack of empathy suggest deeper character flaws that go beyond any treatable condition. The $100,000 she and Robert took from me will never be fully repaid, and the emotional damage they caused will always be part of my story. But I refuse to let their actions define the remainder of my life or destroy my capacity for love and generosity. I'm now 76 years old, and while I'm more cautious about financial decisions and more careful about trusting others, I haven't allowed cynicism to replace the optimism that has sustained me throughout my life. I still believe that most people are fundamentally decent, though I now understand that there are exceptions that require vigilance and appropriate boundaries. The dream of becoming a grandmother may never be realized, at least not through Robert, but I've found other ways to nurture the next generation through my volunteer work and relationships with the children of friends and neighbors. Family, I've learned, can be defined by more than just blood relationships. This experience has taught me that justice doesn't always come in the form we expect or hope for. The legal system provided some accountability for Victoria and Robert's actions, but the most meaningful justice has come from my own resilience and my refusal to let their betrayal destroy my spirit. Every month, when I receive Robert's small restitution payment, I'm reminded of the choices that brought us to this point. But I'm also reminded of my own strength in surviving this betrayal and building a new life from the wreckage they left behind. As I sit in Theodore's old chair each evening, looking at the family photos on the mantelpiece, I sometimes wonder what might have been different if I had been more suspicious or less generous on that Christmas Eve when Victoria made her announcement. But dwelling on such questions is futile. The past cannot be changed, and the future remains unwritten. What I know for certain is that I survived one of the most devastating betrayals imaginable, and I'm still here, still fighting, still believing that life has meaning and purpose, despite the cruelty that some people are capable of inflicting on others. That resilience, I believe, is my ultimate victory over Victoria and Robert's attempts to destroy me. The story of that Christmas revelation will always be part of who I am, but it is not the end of my story. At 76, I still have chapters left to write, and I intend to make them count.